Hey y'all, my name is Jake Myers. I am the head of field sales for a startup called Atmosphere TV, and you are listening to the Who Are You podcast.
Welcome to the Who Are You podcast, a project that explores how to understand and live out your life's purpose. In this limited series, we will interview people whose unique experiences and insights will increase your self-awareness and help you live a more meaningful life. Today's guest is Jake Myers. Welcome, Jake. Jake will help us get clarity around how to accelerate your career path. In a really short amount of time, he's risen the ranks in the corporate world and made a huge impact at every stop along the way. If you've ever thought like, hey, how can I get promoted? What can help me stand out amongst my peers? That sort of thing, then this conversation should be for you. I have always felt that Jake had I would just say it as, describe it as the it factor. Do you know what I mean by that, Cecily?
Yep.
Because I have it, obviously. You can't really define it, but I'm wondering if today, Jake's insights will help us figure out at least something that our listeners can, use or maybe point us in the right direction. And we can pull from Jake's experiences and help people achieve more than they thought possible in their careers. Here's a little more information about Jake. So he is a seasoned, dynamic sales leader, educator, and public speaker. As a multifaceted professional, he seamlessly navigates between roles as a revenue leader of a newly minted billion-dollar startup, an adjunct professor, captivating speaker, and devoted aficionado of consumer psychology. Don't make me read big words like that ever again, Jake, please and thank you. He currently serves as Senior Vice President, Brand Partnerships at Atmosphere, the world's leading streaming TV service for businesses, offering original audio optional TV channels. It's a really cool company. And just really excited to get to know you better on an even deeper level, I would say today, Jake. So welcome to the show, man.
Thanks, Clark. Good to see you.
Happy to have you here. And so just for starters, you are in Austin, Texas, right?
Austin, Texas. That's right. Keep it weird.
We're not in Austin, Texas, but we're still weird. So a couple just things to start off with Jake. So I've known you for how long? Probably 7-8 years, maybe something like that.
Yeah. Probably 2017, 2018.
Yeah. Okay. So something like that. We got introduced through a mutual friend and it was for business purposes. I like to do business with my friends, though, is the way I describe it. So there's someone that I think, oh, this is a cool person. I think we could be friends. Does that sound like an appropriate way to say it?
Yeah.
So I thought.
Am I your friend?
No, definitely not. We are more than friends. We are. You're my first hire. No? Okay, yeah, great.
I don't know if I'd say it like that.
She got stuck on more than just friends.
I know, like that.
Okay. I didn't mean it. Cecily is always correcting me and chopping me off at the knees. It keeps you really humble, for sure. But when we got together, I was like, okay, when you meet a lot of people, you think you're pretty good at sizing people up, I would say, after a while. And so after I met you, Jake, for the first time, we had a discussion. I thought, man, this guy is really sharp. He's impressive. And I candidly don't think that very often when I meet people for the first time, especially in a business context. And so we worked together professionally and just kept in touch over the years and even through some of your career transitions and moves and stuff like that. And I'm really grateful for that relationship. So if you wouldn't mind, just tell us a little bit about your backstory. So I'm thinking things like, where'd you grow up, where you went to school, kind of set the stage for everybody before we dive into the career path stuff.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I grew up in Northeast Ohio, just outside of Akron, a little town called Stowe, Ohio. Grew up there in very lower middle class, I guess I would say. So we were in the middle class. We were one of those, they say to buy the worst house in the best neighborhood. I think we just, that's what we could afford. But salt of the earth parents, salt of the earth family, great upbringing. And then I went to Stowe, Ohio, their public school there down the street. Eventually going to Kent State University, where I studied business management and international relations with a minor in Spanish. Got involved there in fraternity and sports. I was a baseball player by trade. I was better at that than I was at hoops, but I always wanted to play more hoops. Better at baseball than I was at basketball. Something about my biological makeup just didn't have it in the cards for me. But so Northeast Ohio, born and raised, but I haven't lived there since, probably about 2008. So I did a stint in Tampa, Florida. I did a stint in Columbus, Ohio. I'm here in Austin, which has really satiated that wanderlust that I grew up with. Still born and raised Northeast Ohio, but there's something about the cold weather that just it's not for me, not for this guy. So I'll come down here and sweat it out in Austin, Texas, where it's I think 105 degrees today, and kind of deal with it. But yeah, I got the Northeast Ohio roots. So there's somebody else that claims to be just a kid from Akron, but really I think I'm the one that holds that title.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So you already said something super interesting. You talked about lower middle class. And of course, we all define those terms very differently. So when you talk about your family makeup, if you're comfortable talking about this, that is, what was it that, your mom or your dad or, your parents or guardians, what did they do for a career, for a living? Tell us about that.
Yeah, my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and something I didn't openly share for a long time because of, I don't know, call it shame, call it insecurity. But so I was homeschooled the vast majority of my life until high school, actually. And actually, I will pinpoint that one. I didn't share it a lot because people were like, the look I would get when I would share that with people, were like, oh, that's why you're like this. That's why you're so weird. But anyway, so my mom was a stay-at-home mom. My old man is a graphic designer by trade. A preacher / pastor / serial entrepreneur, really just salt to deal with people. And they're folks that were very faith-based and they were very altruistic. And so I call it kind of a wealth guilt that they had. So growing up, every time we would have money, they would find a way of sharing that love with other folks. And so, we did a lot of paycheck to paycheck growing up, but, couldn't be more grateful for, the morals and the values and everything else that were instilled in me growing up. But from a financial perspective, it was, we were that lower middle class group.
Interesting. Okay. So tell us a little bit about what you like to do. You talked a little bit about sports. Was there anything else that really switched you on growing up, or was it just kind of sports and that's it?
It was mostly sports growing up. I mean, I was convinced that I was either going to be a professional athlete, which was completely unfounded by my rec league mediocrity, but either be a professional athlete or really what I started to hone in on that I never pursued was I was addicted to SportsCenter. And so I thought I'd be some kind of a sports journalist or on-air talent, something like that. So it was all sports adjacencies, really till I got into college. It was, how do I hone in on this thing this passion that I have for sports. So a lot of baseball, a lot of basketball, cross-trained across football, and some other sports, but, really that's what it was. I mean, all growing up, it was going to be my life journey was to land in professional sports.
Nice. Homeschooled kid, just a kid from Akron.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting a lot of good nuggets here already. All right, that's cool. I had in my list of questions to talk with you about your familial makeup more than anybody else I'm interviewing. And I had, I suppose, a hunch or a premonition, whatever you want to call it, that you didn't come from, a place of huge status or anything like that. And I think I mean that in the nicest possible way. By the way, but I think with all that you've accomplished, you demonstrate such a high level of humility. And if I were to meet you just casually in a non-professional setting, I would have no idea that you've accomplished everything you have.
Yeah. I think what I'm most grateful for in the way that I grew up is that, it became very obvious to me early on that, discipline was going to become just a fundamental part of what I needed to do to create the life that I wanted. And so, watching, my old man who again, completely salt of the earth, one of the sharpest cats I know, watching him work his butt off and then also have to, kind of survive in a making ends meet environment. I decided, at a really young age, actually, I know exactly the age. It was at age 10 that whatever I wanted out of this life, I was going to financially is that I was going to go get it. And so there was a pair of Penny Hardaways that I really wanted when I was 10 years old for the rec league basketball team that I was probably pretty mediocre at. And I said, I'm going to buy these things one way or another. So I signed up for a paper delivery route back when there was things like paper boys. And so I started waking up at, 5 a.m. and I'd go deliver my papers from, 5 to 6:30 and go home, catch another couple hours of sleep. But next thing you know, I was making enough money to buy, a few different pairs of Penny Hardaways. And so it became very apparent to me early on in life that, we'll go back to our other boy that's a kid from Akron. Nothing is, when you come from Northeast Ohio, nothing is given, everything is earned. And so it was just something that I realized at an early age was, these things that you want out of life, you got to go create that for yourself.
So that was kind of innate in you, which is super interesting. By the way, I'm a former paper boy as well, and lots of really good lessons there. I was like 8, 9, 10 years old doing that paper route, and the Mansfield News Journal made me go do collections. I had to go to the houses and be like, I need your money. I was going to like people who are way older than me, demanding that the News Journal get paid.
Did they pay an exact change? Because I remember when I did that, I would get an envelope and it would actually have the coins in it too. It'd have the cash and the coins. So you'd put that back in the bag and it would jingle on your way home.
Yeah. And I remember one guy, like, he would yell at me about, I'll pay you when I pay you. Those are good lessons to learn that young.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So it leads really nicely to my next question. So it's like you're reading my script here, but it was about when you were a kid, were you always wheeling and dealing? Were you seeking compromises? Were you that kid? Or were you simply just thinking ahead strategically and that sort of thing? I mean, something is clearly a little bit different about you. And again, I mean that in the best way possible.
I'll take it as the underlying compliment it was meant to be. I don't know about wheeling and dealing necessarily. I think the funny thing is my entire career is in sales. And I swore up and down from, early age all the way through college, actually, that I would never go into sales. I was like, there's absolutely no way I would go into sales. That's for stupid people. I mean, honestly, that was the opinion I had growing up. I was like, if you don't know what you want to do with your life, if you're a bad student, just go sell cars at the local dealership or whatever it might be, right? Because there's that stigma around that. However, as I did start my journey into sales, it became very clear to me that early on at age 10 and then up to age 12, I wasn't really delivering those newspapers. But to your point, we did have to do some collections. So whether that was mafia training or whatever it was, there was some lessons learned in there about collecting, doing the runs, doing the route and collecting. But it became obvious to me that I did actually start my sales journey way earlier than I thought. So at age 12, I grabbed the mower out of the garage and, I wanted to up the ante a little bit. I was still delivering newspapers and I wanted to up the ante a little bit, make a few more bucks. So I started walking around the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking people if they wanted somebody to mow their lawn for them. You set up 4, 5, 6 accounts at that age and you're doing pretty good. And so it became obvious to me after I got into sales that it turned out I was actually in sales back at like age 12, because at the time I didn't see it as that. At the time I just saw it as I've got this resource, this lawnmower, and these are people who don't want to mow their own lawn. So I'll go knock on their door and ask if they want me to do it. And so it was a realization to me that, there was probably something in there earlier on. I don't know if I was wheeling and dealing, so to speak, but I was definitely just looking at opportunities to use, whatever tools, physical or tangible tools that were available to me to start generating revenue.
But you were always enterprising is the point. There was always something there. And looking back, you have obviously the benefit of 2020 hindsight and all that kind of stuff. You're like, oh yeah, connecting the dots. You were always that kind of a guy. Okay, so let's fast forward a little bit then. So you're a good athlete, maybe not a premier athlete, able to play in the NBA or whatever. You go to Kent State. What's the journey like there? I mean, are you thinking, okay, I have this minor, I think in Spanish, you said, so like, do you want to do something internationally? What are you thinking? How do you get into your first sales job then, since you're so vehemently opposed to it for so long?
Great question. So I started doing a little bit of post-secondary my senior year of high school at Kent State. And so I had a few extra credits there, which is really mind-boggling, because despite that, the post-secondary credits that I got while I was still in high school, I still ended up doing 5 years of undergrad. Not for any other reason than being rudderless. So I was going for a business management degree. And along the way, I picked up an international relations degree, because at the time, I don't know if they do now, but at the time they didn't have an international business degree. And so I ended up doing 2 kind of parallel programs at the same time. So I was getting the business management degree, the international relations degree, which had to have some kind of a minor to it. So I went with Spanish to do, international business kind of in Central and South America. Back to the enterprising part, it was one of those things where I was looking at it. I'm like, okay, listen, like school's not going to pay for itself. So I was doing construction, kind of the tail end of high school and then through college, doing like subcontracting. And to your point, Clark, about enterprising. So it was a buddy of mine and we just started a little subcontracting business. And so it was our entity that we were running, and then we were working for these contractors. So it was just summer. It was like when school broke in high school and then in college. When school broke at the beginning of summer, we would do construction all the way through. We'd save our pennies and we'd throw some down at tuition, and we'd take care of board for the year, and then we go back to school. And so at that point, yes, still fairly rudderless. Wasn't sure where that was going to land after school, but knew that it was paying pretty well. We ended up hiring like 8-10 of our buddies. They were working for us in the summers. And that was what was getting us through. But still really had no idea. And then I also had the distinct privilege of graduating from Kent in 2008. So for those of us who remember how awesome that economy was right after the housing market just completely dumped out on everyone, there wasn't a lot available, right? And so I had gone through these years of just kind of making it happen wherever I could make it happen. And then I realized what I'd really like is some professional development. I'd really like to see how it's done at other and higher levels. And I had some buddies who had gone over to Enterprise Rent-A-Car out of undergrad, and they were like, hey, why don't you come on over here? And I think they might have actually used the tagline when they called. They're like, hey, they give you the tools to run your own business, right? that I'm in on. So it's
a great training ground, though. It's wonderful,
it is, right? It absolutely is. Yeah. Their training and development is second to none when it comes to salespeople, and really even the business acumen that comes with salespeople. Because I think that's one of the biggest misses in sales in general is that a lot of programs, a lot of organizations, they teach people some of the core fundamentals of sales, but they don't teach those business principles that go with it. How does generating top line revenue impact bottom line? How do you think purposefully about product set and profit margins and things like that? Because if you can understand those fundamentals earlier on, things like comp plans, things like organizational right sizing or accelerated growth, those things don't make a lot of sense. But when you have those underlying principles, it starts to make a lot more sense. So I did a quick stint at Enterprise, to learn some of those tools and to get some of that training. And then there was a day where it was -2 degrees outside, and I had my nice crisp white pressed button down and my tie and my pea coat on, and I was vacuuming out a car. And I said, all right, I think I've learned about what I can learn. And then I picked up and headed down for warmer, greener pastures and warmer temps down in Tampa, Florida.
So when you were in college, you scaled your first business without even realizing it, probably. You didn't even know what scaling meant probably back then.
Didn't have a clue. It was just one day we were making, I think at the time we were making $16 an hour with these contractors. And they asked if we had any buddies who wanted to join. And we said, sure. And we said, well, what are you going to pay them? And they said, well, it's $16 an hour. So you pay them whatever you want to pay them. We'll pay you. And we said, that sounds like a great deal. So we found a bunch of guys who wanted to work for $10 an hour. And the other six went to the business. Superior Solutions was the name of the business. So the other 6 for each hour, each one of those man hours went to Superior Solutions. And then, we did. We scaled up. We started getting enough business that we could, we could generate higher rates and larger teams. And then we got to a point where we were graduating where we were doing actually a lot of that kind of like government supervisory work. We were just driving from job site to job site to make sure people were set up. And then we'd go hang, and then we'd go back and do our rounds at the end of the day. It was pretty cool.
That is so cool. So you go to Enterprise, which we're talking Enterprise up, great training program. We're not sponsored by them, just, full disclosure. Obviously being facetious.
They know
right.
The Who Are You podcast is, and they said, we want that.
Little self-deprecating humor. But you got to this point, we had another epiphany, and you're like, okay, I've learned a fair amount here. It's time to move on. So did you have a job lined up in a warmer climate, or did you just say, I'm ready to try something new? That's when the wanderlust kind of kicked in.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about business acumen. When I left there, it was maybe the lowest business acumen move I've ever made in my life. I was leading with the heart at age 24. So I chased a girl down to Tampa, Florida. So I was actually thinking about going to Miami, where a buddy of mine, his family has they're very well connected down there. They have a lot of businesses and things down in South Beach. And so I was thinking about that. And then I started dating a gal who got the in-arena host and sideline reporting job for the Tampa Bay Lightning. And so I said, all right, let's go to Tampa instead and see how that goes. So no, I did not have anything lined up. Packed up the car. Luckily, I had saved some pennies along the way and packed up the car and moved to Tampa and then figured it out from there.
You basically are LeBron, because you went to South Beach as well. Or you wanted to
I would like to clarify on that I moved to Florida. What was it? January 1st, 2010. And he did not make his decision to take his talents to Florida until 6 months later. And then I came back to Ohio in January of 2014, and he also did not decide to bring his talents back to the state of Ohio until a few months later.
What a trendsetter you are.
Yeah, he's just following me around, but then eventually went to LA, and I'm not going to LA. So.
That's true. And LeBron James has run over my sister. So
that's right.
we all have these LeBron connections that are really not connections, actually. They're more imagined connections.
Adjacencies, yes.
Okay, so you're leading with your heart, which is really cool and kind of cute at 24. That's awesome. So you go down to Florida. What happens then? How are you able to land some gainful employment?
Yeah, well, let's go for the sake of posterity here. That gal that I chased is now my wife. So let's just make sure that's out there in the ecosystem. Yeah. So
that was gonna be my follow-up question. Wow, where's she
who is this gal? Now it turns into TMZ. Paris Hilton. What was his name? Paris. I don't know. Paris Hilton. There we go. Where you at? So what ended up happening? A crazy course of events. So we were literally moving into an apartment down there, and we come walking out the door on a Sunday morning to go watch. It was the fall. To go watch the Cleveland Browns, because again, you can't change where you're from, Cleveland sports. And two folks come walking out of the apartment across the hall. And again, this is in Tampa, Florida, and they're wearing Browns jerseys. So we just strike up a conversation. Turns out there's this group of about 15, 20 people down there who were all from Ohio that had moved down to Tampa. And folks that were in that group were working for a company called Proactive Components at the time, which was basically a brokerage firm for microchips, electronic components, so forth and so on. So for y'all or anybody who ends up listening to this, if you've seen the movie War Dogs, that's basically the best way I can describe it, right? Is instead of selling guns to mercenaries, we were selling electronic components and other components to defense contractors. And so there's that skip forward in that movie where they're on this website called Dibs, and that was half my life for about 4 years was tracking down government contracts that were open for bid, tracking down suppliers for those parts and components, and then selling those to defense contractors, mostly across the country. But it was an international gig where we were buying and selling, all over the world. So we would get there about 7:30 in the morning. We'd start working our far Eastern time zones, a lot of the Chinese suppliers that were still in, and then we'd spend our morning working through those time zones, catching people before their day was over. We'd take a nice 2-hour break, and we'd go to the gym. It was a bunch of meatheads at this place. I say that lovingly because some of them might end up hearing this, but all really, really good dudes. We all had a great relationship. We'd go to the gym for a couple hours. We'd come back, and then we'd start working through our U.S. time zones until we got to California, and then we'd call it a day. So it was a really cool introductory into international business, understanding how international law governs and doesn't, those types of transactions, understanding how to sell across not just time zones but language barriers, cultural barriers, so forth and so on. So it was a really, really good learning experience, and I literally kind of stumbled into that one. I'd love to take any amount of credit for that, but really it was just meeting some folks and networking into that opportunity.
So I'm going to struggle with this transition here, but I think it's probably time to start talking about, because we haven't gone through the complete arc of your career yet, but I would say that, from there, you gain some valuable experience once again. At some point, you kind of leapfrog others, I think. I mean, at some point, you become super promotable. And so I'm thinking in some of your previous positions, you got to pretty high level positions, executive positions, and how did you do that? I mean, what made you or makes you so promotable, if that's the right word? And if you want to weave into this answer a little bit more about your story and, some of your stops along the way, that's okay too. But what is it that you think makes you so promotable? Is that a fair question?
I think so. Let's back to Jonah Hill and skip forwards. Let's do the skip forward here, Clark.
Okay.
So on the skip forward. So great experience down there, but I knew that I hadn't found my calling yet. These were all checked boxes for me. This was something where I was really investing my time. Getting into sales, I was grabbing every book you could possibly read to try to master the art of this sales thing that I said I would never go into, but that I find myself into. And really that was based on some coaching that I got from a family friend coming out of school where I said I wasn't going to go into sales. And he said, "Hey, I'll tell you what, don't go into sales if you don't want to go to sales, but I'll give you this one piece of advice." This is back in 2008 when, the economy was shit, stay on the revenue generating side of business and you'll always be in control of your destiny. And so I really locked into that. And I said, okay, if I'm going to do this, how do I master it? So I'm reading everything I can put my hands on, from Brian Tracy to any other, authors or thought leaders in the space to try to master it. What I found was that, there was a bit of a sticking point in that. And so we get married and we move back to Ohio, and that's when I get into media. And I think that's when I really found my calling. And that's when I really got introduced to, the true feeling of imposter syndrome, right? So you get to a new industry, you feel like you've done pretty good in the last one and you pretty well mastered it, but now you're in a whole new space where you have to sell something you don't know anything about. And so, took that opportunity to really start mastering it. I'm still in an individual contributor role. I'm selling media and advertising services, and I'm just looking for anybody that I can get information from, right? So you get the formal training, and then you're like, all right, that's as far as that goes. I've got clients who need things, and I can't provide that to them. So how do I keep self-educating? So I find every person in this organization that I could possibly learn from, and I take everything from them that I can. I'm like, I fancy myself like a professional, like locust, right? It's just like go in, suck up all the stuff I can suck up, and then move on to the next thing. And I got to a point with that organization where I felt like I had done that as many times as I could, and I still wasn't quite meeting those client needs. We didn't quite have that set of tools to meet those client needs. And so where I started to jump forward quite a bit was introduction to Gatehouse Media and what was at the time called Propel Marketing, which is an in-house digital agency for a big media company. And same deal where I jump over and I'm doing channel sales for them, where it was post-acquisition. I would go in and do kind of talent assessments and operational assessments, and then I would help these new channel partners to sell more of these products. And at that point, now I'm starting to travel across the country. I'm sitting with executives, I'm sitting with CEOs, I'm sitting with publishers and heads of state, and really starting to understand this larger media landscape while trying to pulling that information in, while also pulling all of the real technical side of the digital marketing ecosystem in. And it was really about absorbing as much of that as I possibly could, but also constantly looking for that next subject matter expert that I could pull more information from. And I think the probably the most pivotal point in my career was when I was pulling in all of this information, and primarily in the digital marketing side. And I get to a point where the people that I used to go to for answers to my questions, they didn't have the answers anymore. And I'd go looking for another person, and they didn't have the answer anymore. And there was a very distinct point in time for me where I looked around and I said, okay, if people don't have the answers internally anymore, you might now be that person, right? Like you need to now look at this a little bit differently. Now go get your information, externally. How do you become a student of your space and your industry, and not just how do we do it as an organization? And then you pull that information back into the organization and start to build that thought leadership. And I think it was the most pivotal point for me was I used to always look at everybody else around me, and I still do, is how do I hang out with the smartest people? But from a technical perspective, I always fancied it that I was way behind everybody else. And once I started to catch up, I realized now you need to be the person with the answers, right? Send the elevator back down to make sure that anything that you're learning, you're then sharing with, colleagues, peers, direct reports, so forth and so on. Because right up until that moment, for me, it was all about like, how can I get more so that I can do better? How can I get more so I can do better? And now it becomes the dissemination of information that's the most important.
Was all that knowledge you earned influencing product and service decisions at your company then too?
Yeah, it really was. I mean, that was where I learned that every single decision that you make when you're client facing has to be based off of unmet client needs, right? We start with unmet client needs. What is the market demand of us as an organization, as individuals, especially in the service industry, right? Because if you're providing professional services and you're not starting with those unmet needs, then you're probably just going to be jumping into a red ocean, right? You're just another name, another face, another brand of people trying to sell a commoditized offering to somebody, when in reality, we should be looking at what are the non-commoditized needs of the marketplace, and then what are the organizational gaps to fill those. So yes, had a lot of conversations. We implemented and vetted out a lot of different products as a result of seeing that we weren't providing quite holistic enough of a set of solutions for folks. And so one of my favorite quotes from a colleague is, speak with your revenue mouth, right? So I might have seen that those things were gaps before, but nobody really cared because I didn't have the client need to match it. And so you go out and you do these discovery processes, you do these immersion processes with your clients, and then you find that there's gaps, and you come back and you say, hey, look at all these additional folks that we could help if we had these other product sets, if we had these other solutions for them. And so, yeah, we did a lot of innovation as a result of those findings.
This is going to be a meta-analysis of this conversation. So it's probably going to get weird, just be warned. But I'm listening to you talk. And for one, you speak quickly because you probably think really quickly, which is great because you're smart. But how do you hear yourself when you talk? Like, that's not normal, the ability to process information the way that you do rapid fire in just a conversation like this, but also thinking about you when you're probably 29, 30, I don't even know. You're this young guy and you're thinking about things that way, and you're processing information, you're analyzing what this great big organization needs. I just don't think that that's normal. I don't think that's a normal skill set. And I've only been able to even have little tiny slivers of those kinds of thoughts as a result of mentors kind of like hitting me over the head repeatedly until I finally understand a little bit of their insights. So like, did you have someone kind of pulling you in any organization, like at Gatehouse? Did you have a mentor, a high-powered person in your life who gave you a lot of these insights? Or were those, again, going back to the childhood thing, which I think is always so interesting, like you had this innate enterprising nature, this initiative, this motor that you had from a very early age. So what was that? That to me, when I'm hearing you talk, I'm like, I can't keep up with you. And I mean that again in a very flattering way, but how did you get like that, Jake? I don't get it.
Well, I appreciate it. For starters, I appreciate it. Well, one of my mentors, Lori Marsh, who was the head of Leadership Columbus when I went through that program a few years back. One of my favorite pieces of advice she gave me was to reject a compliment is to ask for it twice. So I'm going to choose not to be really self-critical there and reject that. I appreciate it. I think the other thing on the self-deprecating side is my recall is shit. Like just my actual recall is shit. So like when I sit on the couch with my wife and she can crush Jeopardy, like I swear to God, she should actually be on Jeopardy. She's like that gal from White Men Can't Jump. Like she just on it. Like I got to get her on it. My recall is shit. But there was something that I noticed when I was younger about the way that I like to look at, and not like to, just the way my brain is wired. I don't take credit for this, but the way my brain is wired about like systems and connectivity and the interconnectedness of things. Right.
Yeah.
So I spend a decent amount of time. I would describe myself as an outgoing introvert. Right. When I'm put into a social setting, I don't struggle with that, but I don't necessarily seek out constantly being in social settings. Mm-hmm. Part of that might be being in sales where it's kind of constant anyways. But when I go to process things, I think it's all about the interconnectivity of things. The speed at which I talk is also a little bit newer. That has a lot to do with some of the public speaking experience and knowing that people's attention spans are about that long these days. So if you got something to say, get it out. But anyways, I think from a mentorship perspective, another saying that everything that I say today and ever is always stolen from somebody else. But another piece that I liked from a former colleague was they looked at mentorship as collecting puzzle pieces. And so we're all building these puzzles in our lives, right? And we're looking at it like there's going to be this complete picture someday. I gave up on that a while ago. It's all about the journey now. But as far as putting that puzzle together is that, I think sometimes when it comes to mentors, we put a little bit too much pressure on each mentor to be a complete advisor for us versus looking at our mentors as what puzzle pieces do they have for me? Because the puzzle pieces they might have for us are based on their journey and their experience, so forth and so on. And so, yes, I'd say that, I've had a tribe of mentors, right? So everybody from, Dan Zarillo and Peter Schofield and Sean McDonald, who brought me into that Propel Marketing /Thrive5 /Gatehouse mold and gave me some great advice on every step of the way in terms of really leveling up into executive leadership, to Brad Harmon and Paul MacArthur and Blair Heavey and Jim Porter and Bill Albrecht, like all these folks who along the way, I got puzzle pieces from. And I think that's probably the most important piece for me. There's actually a guy that I won't say his name, but there was a person that I do not personally want my brand associated with. And there were two really important puzzle pieces that I got from that guy, despite not necessarily liking him as a person. There were two really important puzzle pieces that I picked up along the way from him, primarily around building great teams, and one was, the best time to recruit is when you have a fully built out team and you look for people who would bring your average up at all times. Right. And the second was, to make sure that you're always replacing yourself. Right. So we talk about grooming, we talk about, prepping people and succession planning, but ultimately, are you truly investing in somebody that you think could take your job one day? And if you're not, then you're probably not prepping yourself for the next thing, because somebody might not promote you, because if they pull you out, they create this massive gap in this vacuum. And so I think when it comes to mentorship for me, it's just, as you continue to expose yourself to people, if there's something that you find interesting about them, make sure that you ask a lot of questions, you ask them for their time, and you look for those puzzle pieces they might be able to provide for you.
So do you think that those relationships helped propel you to newer levels as well? Because you're not a bureaucratic creature. Like, I don't think you would do well in an environment that's not highly entrepreneurial. But you still manage to navigate the corporate world and do it so successfully. So that's the part I'm not quite understanding it, and I'm not putting the puzzle pieces together about your life, but how you were able to so successfully navigate that. And it's also striking because you have always, even as a kid, been aware of a lot of really strategic and high level business concepts, but you didn't have any terms for them. Strategic thinking, systemic thinking, scaling. Well, we've talked about all this stuff and it's super striking to me. So how did you do it? So like you're at Gatehouse, big organization, lots of players involved, but you rise up to, I think you're like a VP or president of sales or something like that. I mean, how did you do that? Explain that to me.
Yeah, I think, just another great piece of advice that I got from a gal named Teresa Hicks is it was her family mantra growing up, and it was be honest, be honorable, and be humble. And I'll use the term humility, but I'll make it a little bit more real. That chip on my shoulder and that constant feeling of imposter syndrome / insufficiency / you still have to prove yourself every single day. I think, that probably brought some humility, but mostly it was more of a chip on my shoulder than anything else, which was, as I was exposed to some of these executive leaders, I couldn't work hard enough to prove to them that I deserved a seat at the table. And the vast majority of the time I was the youngest person with the seat at the table. And so to me, I think a lot of it was not taking any opportunity for granted. It's like the Richard Branson saying, it's like, say yes, anything that you're asked to do, say yes, and then figure out the details later. Right. First time I was offered an opportunity to be an adjunct at Ohio State, I said yes. And then when I went to figure out the details, it turned out that I just committed to about 100 hours worth of work. Well, that's a math equation I will go to the grave never doing in terms of what I made per hour for those 100 hours invested in that first 10-hour class that I taught. But say yes and then figure out the details later. And I think early on in your career, it's really, really, really important. And then as you see the fruits of your labor come along, that's when the word no becomes more important. And that's a word that I'm really still uncomfortable with today. I don't say no to enough stuff. And then I stretch myself too thin. And I think those are lessons that would be great had I learned ahead of time, but I learned them through experience, and that's where we are. So saying yes early on, and then just studying your ass off and just doing everything that you can to execute on something. And then later on, once you stretch yourself a little too thin, is figuring out the art of no.
Do you think that insecurity can be used as a weapon, especially as you're doing your best to make it in the world?
I do. I think insecurity and humility can go hand in hand, right? I think if we acknowledge that some of those insecurities are maybe holding us back, is maybe we lean into them and we say, how can this insecurity lead to humility? But I think that chip on the shoulder is something that we all have to look at as fuel. And if I think there's insecurity, and then there's inferiority, where we're not willing to say yes to that thing. And I think it was that evolution from not saying yes to the opportunity because we didn't feel like we were worthy, to saying yes to it and then proving to ourselves more than anybody else that maybe we are worthy. And you can't just do that with acts, right? And I'm a therapy guy, so I'm a big fan of it. Go talk to the therapist about it. But also stretch yourself, right? Stretch yourself. That insecurity, that insecurity, humility, and imposter syndrome, in my opinion, they're all hand in hand. But the more times you say yes and then lean into the work that needs to be done to kill those learning curves, the more opportunities are going to be presented to you.
Okay. Can you walk us through your first executive or big boy job, whatever you want to call it? And maybe the way to describe it would be where you felt truly stretched in the role. If you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I definitely felt stretched in some of the examples I gave already. Like, in that channel sales role, when I'm, 30 years old and I'm walking into rooms where nobody's under 50, that was big, right? However, I was kind of a subject matter expert at that point. And so when I was brought in, it was like, all right, let's talk to the young buck about the digital thing, right? And it kind of made sense. After we bought our largest competitor in 2019, leading into January of 2020. So now we're getting into those exact dates that everyone's very, very familiar with, right? The beginning of 2020. I was teaching a class at Ohio State, and I was in a VP role at the time. And we had just bought our biggest competitor, and there was what we called the Hunger Games going on. So the C-suite, we were deciding who was going to stay, who was going to go. And as the layers went down, and my boss at the time, his name was Brian Rittenauer, and he was named to the regional president of sales for the Southwest Division on a Friday. The email went out on a Friday, and it said, congratulations to Brian Rittenauer. He's going to go celebrate with his wife in the Bahamas for the weekend, and we'll welcome him back on Monday. And I got a call on Sunday night from my HR partner, and I was close with my HR partner, but you get a call on a Sunday from your HR partner, something probably happened, right? And she shared with me that Brian had passed while scuba diving over the weekend. He went into cardiac arrest. 3 kids. I mean, just as tragic as it gets. And so I was processing that, and I got a call about a week later from his boss, who was my boss's boss at the time, and she asked me if I would consider taking this role and moving down to Austin for this role, and considering taking over for Brian. And I was honestly at the time I said I can't even think about that because not to get into details, but because he was in the Bahamas, they literally hadn't even brought his body back yet, and I said I can't even think about that. And then I spent some time with it. I prayed about it. I talked to my wife about it, and it was like, hey, what better opportunity to carry the torch of somebody that you respected, like a Brian who passed away, than to take this role and say yes. And so I did that, moved my family across the country in the middle of COVID, and stepped into that role and realized that everybody else that was reporting to me had more experience than I did in this business, right? In the industry and in the business. And so that I think that stretch of looking at it and saying like, okay, like I mentioned T Hicks earlier, she was one of the VPs in the division. And I said, T, you're 25 years older than me, 20 years older than me, and you are killing it. You've seen everything. How could I possibly help you? And, so we just talked through it. And I think there's back to humility and that insecurity / humility. I think walking in every scenario and when you're stretched and just saying like, here's what I think I know and what I'm fairly confident in, here's what I think I don't know, and seeking first to understand where are the resources, where are the tools, where are the really smart people, so that you can build, quote unquote lieutenants, or you can build a team of folks who complement your weaknesses. So you can double down on your strengths, you can kill the learning curve on some of your weaknesses, but ultimately when that imposter syndrome sets in, those butterflies, that should turn into excitement, which means you're about to learn, right? Good, better, different. You're about to learn. And it's just really, how do you handle those situations and lean into them and be very, very, vulnerable and transparent with folks about where you're at personally and professionally, so that you can band together.
Remember you talking about that whole time in your life and how tragic that was, and may he rest in peace. And so out of that tragedy comes this opportunity for you, which you then embrace. And then the vulnerability is super interesting. But I can tell by Cecily's body language here that she has to ask a question of you. So we'll let Cecily interrupt.
Kind of going back to what you were talking about before, you said the art of saying no, and you need to get better at that. Where do you feel like that shift came in your career? Because, when you're young in your career, it's like you said, say yes, and that'll build you up in your career. Well, when you get to those more executive level, senior level positions, you're kind of at that point where you don't really necessarily have to say yes to everything, and you can get to that point of, they say the art of saying no. So where do you feel like you saw that shift, and how are you handling it now?
Yeah, it's a great question. There was actually 2 shifts, and the first shift was I had to get over my OCD. And so I am OCD, not to the extent to which, I have to comb the rug, the dangles. But I'm very everything. If I'm organizing something, it's going to be by color or alphabet or whatever. I know how many stairs there are at every staircase in our house. I had to get over that and realizing that, especially in entrepreneurial or intrapreneurial or, revenue generation side of business, you got to be more in that 70 to 80% sure of something and then go. Right. So I think the first one was going from everything has to be 100% right and it has to be perfect, and getting a little bit more comfortable with that 70 to 80%, which made me really, really uncomfortable. So I think that was growth. But once I realized that the real pivotal point was once I realized that the quality of what I could produce, whether that's in how much of myself I'm giving to folks who report to me, whether that's what's going out the door to clients and proposals, whether that's preparing properly for client meetings or for one-on-ones, so forth and so on. Once the quality of my work started to decrease and I couldn't find any more hours in the day, that was the pivotal point, was when you keep saying yes to everything, whether that's speaking and adjunct work on top of, a 60 to 80 hour week work schedule. Once the quality of any of those components goes down and you can't find more time, you really have 2 choices. You start saying no, or you find ways to really improve your efficiency. Right. And so I think when you're scaling up, sometimes that's hiring people. Sometimes that's finding automation in your tech stack that maybe you don't have currently. So there's ways to do it and keep saying yes. But ultimately, it was when I can't put my stamp of approval on my own work and the quality of my own work and my interactions. Now it's time to start saying no. I'm still very bad at it, though. So just so you know, it's not something I've meant.
Do you feel like then you've had a shift from the people who have always asked these things of you that now you're saying no? Do you feel like there's been a shift where they well, why can't you say yes to all this anymore? Or do you feel like it's now understandable because you're at a higher level?
That's a really good question and not something I've thought about. I think the best way I could answer that is if there's an art to saying no, there's an art to saying no well, right? And so, I would say that how I try to do it now is I give yes if scenarios, right? So if somebody needs something where otherwise I might have turned that around in 24 hours, or I might have taken on a bunch of work right now for the next few weeks or this quarter or whatever it might be, now I'll say yes if, and then I include the contingencies on that, the considerations on that. When I was in construction, we used to call it the go away pricing. So if you ever get a quote from a contractor and you're like, I got 3 quotes and one of them was literally 3 times the other one.
Yeah.
Why is that? The answer is that's the go away price. That means they're so busy right now. They didn't want to say no to quoting you. They just wanted to put it at a level that made it worth their while. And so I think that opportunity that can come with, I don't like to use the word success because I don't fancy myself successful, but it in some level of success is that you get an opportunity to start giving go away pricing. And that might be actual pricing with clients, which is not what I'm talking about. It's more so when you're being asked to do something and you say, I'd be happy to help you with that. Is that something that we could do next quarter? Right? Is that something that we could do at another time? And then you can roadmap that for yourself and help to prioritize it. So I think there's an art of yes, if in there as well. And then I think when it comes to the no, if it's internal, if it's with your team, I think a lot of times it comes down to empowerment. And I have to ask myself, have I empowered these folks to do this themselves? Or am I being asked to do this again because I was giving fish when I should have been teaching how to fish? And so I don't know if I'm answering your question directly or not, but it's the art of saying no to me comes almost like in a bifurcated process. It's like, why do I need to say no to this? Is it not important? It's kind of like the Stephen Covey, Benjamin Franklin, urgent versus complex, right? And what is your time worth? And how could you potentially empower other folks to advance things further without your involvement?
Jake said bifurcated. That's a heck of a word. That means to split into 2.
My wife, who has maybe the best vernacular of anybody that I know, I used that on her the other day and she didn't know it. And I gave myself a massive pat on the back. I had a word in my vocabulary that she didn't know.
Your wife is lovely, by the way. She's wonderful. Definitely your better half. So this is such an interesting kind of point to stop a little bit here. So, the whole point of this particular episode is how to excel, how to accelerate in your career path once you figure out kind of what you want. So previous episodes talked about how to figure out who you are, what you want, how to handle setbacks along the way, so on and so forth. So I feel like we've gotten a lot of really interesting and good nuggets about how to accelerate your career path and how to use humility as a weapon to take yourself to heights you maybe never even imagined before. I think it's interesting probably also to stop for you and just kind of think, did I ever think I was going to get here? Like as a kid working construction jobs and all this that's fascinating too. You may be, because you work so much and you're so busy, you may not even stop and ever appreciate that notion right there.
Who has time for that? Keep moving forward. Keep moving forward. No, I'm blessed, man. I'm blessed. I know we started off talking about, some of the financially humble beginnings, but I had one of the most incredible family units that you could ever ask for. And so there was a lot of things that were instilled in me at an early age that I think have just played out so incredibly well over time. But I do see life as the journey that it is. I know it's super cliche and douchey, but I do see it as the journey that it is. If I were to pause right now, I would probably be able to come up with a lot of gratitude, and I do focus on that. But ultimately, to me, it's you're only as good as your best you're only as good as your last at bat, right? And so if I stop, my 3 core principles: always learning, always applying, and always teaching. And so anytime that my equilibrium is off, I ask myself, am I learning? Am I applying what I'm learning? And am I teaching it to somebody else? And as long as I'm doing all 3 of those things, I feel pretty fulfilled. But ultimately, sometimes you do have to stop and smell the roses and be grateful. But very blessed to be where I'm at.
So kind of, taking that as a springboard into some of our next sets of questions here would be, so you talk about in your career history, the first stretch position you have, you're in a new geography, you take your family with you, you're in this big job. You talked about expressing vulnerability to your team. I'm very curious about how you appropriately expressed that and how the team reacted to your expressions of vulnerability. And I'll probably have some follow-ups from there, but that is very interesting to me that you, in that kind of a job where you're like, oh my gosh, I am super stretched and I'm just going to be honest and tell the team that I am. I don't know if I've ever heard of a leader doing that.
Yeah, I think a couple answers to that question. I mean, we talked a lot about mentors and where we get things from, and there's two for me that I've never met, and one of them is Brene Brown, and all of her content around vulnerability and how that is the foundational piece for any strong relationship. And so one of the things I like to do is I like to have people watch her TED Talk and then encourage them to continue down her content path with her books and other things, so that we can start to foster that environment of it's okay to be vulnerable, right? It's not just okay, but it's actually required of us if we're going to have strong relationships professionally, personally, as a team, so forth and so on. The other is Kim Scott with Radical Candor, and making sure that we're very, very comfortable at any given point in time. If we're sitting across the table from somebody and we're eating dinner and they have broccoli in their teeth, we're going to tell them they got broccoli in their teeth, right? They're going to expect that. And so how can we do that professionally and make sure that everyone's comfortable doing that? And it's a big part of that, and again, very cliche, but leading from the front. So if you're encouraging an environment with direct, regular feedback because we care personally and we challenge directly, if you're encouraging an environment around vulnerability, you got to lead from the front. And so I think one of the first things that I had to do in that environment was spend time with each individual and be candid with them about where I was in my journey and where I saw them, but then also look for strengths, because everybody likes to be the expert at something, right? Yeah. And so I think at the time I had maybe like 6 VPs. Each one of them had a core foundational, we just call them superpowers. And so then they became the heads of state of those things. One was our chief culture officer, because she can build teams that feel like families. And so she became our chief culture officer, because that's a gap for me. I'm so focused on the task at hand that I have a tendency to not stop, smell the roses, celebrate the wins, so forth and so on. So how do you tap into those superpowers that complement your own vulnerabilities and insufficiencies, while also investing in those individuals so that you can build this unit? So I don't know if I'm answering your question necessarily, but I think it comes from there's strength in vulnerability, right? Because that's what people appreciate about their leaders is if you're pretending to be something that you're not, they're going to sniff that out. And not only are they going to sniff that out, but they're then not going to trust you because you're pretending to be good at something that you're not.
But that seemed to resonate with them though too, where you expressed these thoughts and they didn't try to take advantage of your vulnerability either, though, is what I think I'm hearing.
I have no idea.
Okay.
Maybe they loved it. Maybe they hated it. I don't know. There's one individual that I still have questions about whether or not that was appreciated, but that's probably another topic for another day. But in general, it's one of those things where I've done my best to immerse myself in the best practices as it pertains to sales leadership, and people development. And if I'm constantly pulling in additional resources and information from people who have really blazed trails and pioneered in the space, and those principles aren't working, then I just look at myself and say, maybe I'm not doing it right. But ultimately, I feel like we spend a lot of time, especially in the kind of corporate world, of trying to reinvent the wheel or trying to fight tomorrow's battles with yesterday's weapons. And that's just something that I don't really have any interest in. To me, it's about how do we all get 1% better every single day and do that together to create the rising tide for the organization and for the team.
So something that I'm hearing, and I'm probably inferring this more than anything, but I think about the times that you and I have chatted about your career and just trading emails and stuff with you. I've often thought like, man, that guy has to be under a lot of stress right now. And so first
of all, I'm glad that translates through the emails. So you just exactly where I'm at.
No, and
like
see,
he is losing his mind.
That's why I like really hesitated to ask.
He's coming unwound. He's coming unwound.
Because you always present so well. I think again, it was probably more, me reading into the situation. But I have thought that frequently about you. Like you are in a lot of high pressure situations, and that's something that I struggle with eternally. Is I really struggle to handle stress and let it affect not just my work life, but every domain of my life. So what is it that, you could tell us, and especially I'm thinking about it from the perspective of somebody trying to make it, so to speak, rise through the ranks, make an impact, whatever. I mean, what tips could you give someone about how you manage? Maybe you don't feel it. I don't know. Again, like I said, I'm reading into this more than anything that you haven't told me anything about that, but what is it? What are your secrets there? Because I got to imagine, man, you've been under some stressful situations when you're trying to build this team, and how did that go?
Yeah, no, I think this is probably the most important topic for anybody to be talking about right now, because, everybody that I talk to is dealing with some level of, not just stress, but, I think, macroeconomic stuff, let's not pretend like it doesn't have an impact on
for sure
individuals. Right. And I think everybody's in some version of that right now. We all get the headlines. We see that, the biggest players in the space, right, whether it's Apple or Facebook or Google or whatever, everybody's laying people off. So it can be doom and gloom, but in general, those waves will come and go, right? Those waves will come and go. For me, I think step one was acknowledging that I'm wired that way, right? So we talk about, being 10 and delivering newspapers and things like that. Like I was already thinking about, probably way too big of things than I should have been, and stressing myself out over them. And I never used to call it stress. Stress was a word that I would only use when it came to weakness, right? You're only stressed out if you're weak, because that means you can't handle what you put on your own plate. And coming to terms with that idea, and I think we're better as a society now using terms like stress and anxiety and other things like that.
Yeah.
But, how to battle that. Again, like the art of saying no. I wouldn't fancy myself great at it, but there's a couple of things that I look at. One, I spend a lot of time, researching ways to get around that. I also have narcolepsy. So essentially the way that my sleep patterns work, about every 90 minutes during the day, my brain tries to go to sleep. So I have to stay ahead of that as well. And most of that is with stimulants and caffeine and things like that, which also takes your stress levels up and your anxiety levels up, right? And so the more that I dive into the biology and the neurobiology side, is there is no supplement for physical activity. So, for me, it's wake up in the morning and first things first, right? Wake up in the morning, spend some time with my kids, and then hit the gym, because there's nothing to supplement that type of stress relief other than physical activity. So first things first, get that done. And then from the rest of it is, really focusing on the controllables. We can control what we can control, and we can influence what we can influence, and focusing on the controllables, and then having those kind of core principles, right? Like I shared that mine professionally, to feel fulfillment at any given point in time, always learning, always applying, always teaching. But if we don't have those principles, and especially if, and I did this early on in my career as well, if we're placing way too much value of ourselves, our self-worth, on people's opinions of us, which is how the whole corporate environment is designed to be anyway. Right? The only thing that matters is your boss's opinion, because if your boss tries to save your job and they go to bat for you, they'll probably save your job. If your boss doesn't like you and they don't go to bat for you, you'll probably lose your job, which is your livelihood and your identity, so forth and so on. So I think the biggest thing is two things. One, not placing so much focus on what people think about the work that we're doing, but instead building the relationships so that people, know who we are as an individual, and focusing on mastery of whatever it is that we're working on right now. Because that pursuit of mastery is the reward for the work, not necessarily the promotion. Because if you're a master in your domain, somebody else is going to hire you. But if all you were doing was trying to please your boss, it's not necessarily going to translate to your career. It's only going to translate to that organization, so long as that person's in front of you. So I think those were mistakes I made early on in my career that I've started to go away from, is, just the people pleasing side, and really focusing on what does great work look like, and what does mastery of my role in this industry look like, and then become a master in that thing. And that's really what I've had to focus on and have to recalibrate on when maybe things aren't going as well with a boss or aren't going as well organizationally, because I personally place way too much of my individual value on my profession, and I've had to back off of that.
That's interesting that you spoke on your identity being in your job, because I feel like that's a big component of being in a sales position, because you are constantly, your identity is, if I make this sale, if I meet my mark. So how have you kind of, if you have or haven't, separated the two of your identity not being in how well you're doing at your job?
Good question.
I will tell you that that is a journey for me as well. So I have not. All right. I think that one of those things is that's been valuable for me, is that a lot of my hobbies outside of, playing golf or whatever, but my side hustle, so to speak, like with the adjunct work and other things, that provides balance so that you don't over leverage the value that you place. Because I battle with this, because I do think we should place some part of our identity in our work,
right,
because it's so much of our life. But when we have other things that we're also putting our hands to, and then for me, it's all about harmony of those things. So the harmony for me between being a sales leader and then also being an adjunct is that I teach things about sales leadership and digital marketing, so forth and so on. That makes me pause and think about what makes somebody good at this or good at that, or how do we self-educate around this or that. And that actually makes me better at my day job. Well, my day job is what makes me any good at my adjunct work, right? Because I don't have a degree in education or anything like that. It's bringing real world practice to it. So I think it's like the harmony of the other aspects of our life. And then another big piece of it for me, when it comes to, how do you not put all of your identity into this thing, is about impact and outcomes. And so for me, I knew the second that I went into sales that I wanted to go into sales leadership, because I wanted to be able to help other people get from where they are to where they want to go. And if you break it all the way down, and like Russell Brand has a great bit on this, but he talks about how being altruistic and helping people is actually the most selfish thing that you could ever do, because it's the only thing really, when you break it all down, it's the only thing that gives you pure enjoyment that isn't relegated to the thing, right? So like I like to go scuba diving, I like to wakeboard and snowboard and play golf. All of those things, I get a ton of enjoyment out, and I can get into flow states doing those things, but then they're done when that work is done, because it was just about me. Right? Like maybe when I tell the story of diving in Maui or whatever, like I get some more enjoyment out of it. But ultimately, the things that we get long-term enjoyment out of are how do we use the skills that we've been given or developed to help other people. And so I think that's what I've really had to focus on. And I appreciate that question. It's a great question. It's really had to focus on is the impact and the outcomes. If I say that I'm a leader and not just a sales guy, that better translate to me having an army of people who would be willing to say, yes, Jake will give anything to the people to help them get from where they are to where they're going. And so whatever that is for any individual profession, but it's how are we helping, right? How are we helping somebody else to get from where they are to where they want to be?
I've noticed that every time Cecily asks a question, Jake says, wow, that was a really good question. And I don't think I don't think he said that once.
I'm still waiting for your first good question. No,
radical candor right there. Oh my gosh. No, that was a great question. Well, because I'm OCD as well, and my closet is organized by color, and my wife mocks me relentlessly, I'd be remiss if we didn't kind of sort of finish this narrative of your career. So if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about how you landed at Atmosphere, I would really appreciate it. I think that's a really cool story. And I also think when you talk about this, I think it's like, that's a great example of a good thing happening to a good dude. And, I couldn't be happier for you and more proud of you. You don't need me to say that I'm proud of you, by the way, but I truly am. I think I'm just so happy for all that you've been able to do. And there are so many people in positions of leadership who frankly just shouldn't be there, and they have the wrong motives. They don't truly value or care for people. And I think you're in a spot like this for all the right reasons. And so would just love to hear a little bit about that story and how you got there. And I'll let you go for a little bit there.
Sure. No, appreciate it. For God-fearing folks who might be listening, divine intervention. For those who aren't, maybe the universe just had it in the cards for me. But essentially, as my tenure at Gannett ran out, and I definitely want to share this. If I'm going to talk about vulnerability, I might as well be fully vulnerable here. So as my tenure at Gatehouse/Gannett, just brands, if anybody who wants to research that, you'll see all the different names. But anyways, that last place started to come to an end. We talk about insecurity and vulnerability, so forth and so on. I was pretty cocky cat. All right. I was like, I'm untouchable. My numbers are through the roof, so forth and so on. Your point, Cicely, like, when you're in sales, your number is everything. It hangs over your head, right? It's just like being in sports. It's why so many athletes go into it. The number just hangs over your head, and you better make sure it's the best it can be. And I ultimately ended up getting laid off from that role. And so that happened November 21, I think. I did a retention stay for a while, and I stayed on for 6-8 weeks, something like that. And so the day that I turned in my stuff, my keys, my laptop, all of that to Gannett, I had coffee with one of our founders here at Atmosphere. And it's funny because when I think about that coffee, I just cringe. It's just so cringy because I sat down and, we didn't know each other well. I think we met at a couple of things, but it came through a friend and through a kind of weird 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. But I sat down and I had been telling everybody since I announced that I was exiting and being laid off that I wasn't going to take a serious conversation about a position for at least 3 months, because I'd never taken more than a couple of days off of work. Well, not off of work, but in between jobs. And so I'm like, listen, I'm just going to relax. I'm going to play a lot of golf, living in Austin, year-round golf. I'm going to play a lot of golf. I'm going to bring that handicap down. I'm going to take my family. We're going to go hang out somewhere. We had this place in the south of France we picked out. Long story, but my daughter didn't have a passport, so we had to skip that trip. But we had this whole thing planned out. And so I sit down with one of our founders, and we started hitting it off. And I said, hey, I just got to tell you right now, this is the cringy part. I got to tell you right now, I'm not having any serious conversation for at least 3 months, right? Meanwhile, what he had in the back of his pocket was that they had just received their Series C. They just closed on their Series C cap raise, right? The Series C round. So $100 million that was coming into this business. And so what I was fortunate to have done during those times of transition in the last role was come up with my decision criteria for what I wanted out of the next thing. And, I really only come up with like 3 things at that point. It was, I wanted to get back to building, because as a result of the acquisition and the merger in the last place, there's a lot of laying off. I took over a division with 450 people. By the time I was done 2 years later, it was 125 people. It was a lot of watching people walk out the door and ending a lot of very illustrious careers. And so I was like, I got to get back to building, because that's what I'm really, really passionate about. I need to get to a place where, we're willing to do things the right way, where we don't have a ton of history behind, dogma behind our processes or what we think works. And we're willing to come together and do things the right way. And candidly, I wanted to take a stab at the startup space. I wanted to have some skin in the game and know that, if we could take something from pre-IPO to IPO or to acquisition, so forth and so on, that I would stand to benefit from that financially as well. And so I was fortunate that I didn't have to make too many concessions on that side. And it was just the conversation just went through those decision criteria. And I was like, oh no, this conversation went too well, right? And so we get done with coffee and I go home. My wife's like, how'd it go? And I was like, it was shit. And she's like, what do you mean? And I was like, it hit every single box. Like, it just checked the box of my decision criteria. And my whole goal here was to not have a serious conversation for at least 3 months. But I will say, serendipity, divine intervention, whatever you want to call it, ultimately, for the value of anybody that might see value in this conversation, a lot of it came from, the network and everything else we've talked about on this call, is that if you take very close care of the brand that you build in the marketplace, the doors will just open for you, right? They say, it's better to be lucky than good, and so forth and so on. But also, luck tends to show up for people who work really hard, right? Those doors just tend to open. And I think when you care for your brand, it makes conversations like that a lot easier. And that was the first time that I really got to experience that. It went from a very, very scary space with having, 2 young children and moving across the country for this gig and being laid off and thinking that would never, ever happen to me, to having a great conversation and starting with this organization 5 weeks later, and helping to grow this now to a $1 billion plus organization. Is that it goes from scary to exciting in a very, very short period of time. But you just have to trust the process, and you have to lean into the vulnerability, lean into the network, and let people know when you need something.
Yeah, you want to make God laugh. Try to make some plans, right?
Amen to that.
It's really cool, though. You said, I'm going to put a box around this. I'm going to do this my way. And then you had this amazing opportunity presented. And it's almost comforting, I'm sure, you have to think, yeah, I meant to do this. It was just too perfect. And you probably just were able to have some peace about it and pursue that opportunity with a lot more peace in your heart than you would have otherwise.
Couldn't have said it better. It was, spending that time and really, meditating on it and praying about it, so forth and so on, and coming up with these criteria. And then when those are just met out of the blue, you're like, yes, peace is a great way to put it, because it just made so much sense.
So I don't want to say at the tail end of the journey, because you're not, obviously. I mean, you're building still, you're in build mode. It's an exciting time at Atmosphere, and you can answer this however you want. But what's next for you? What's next for Jake? What's next for your career? What's next for Atmosphere? Where do you go? The big thing I took away from this today was, 2 things. The first thing is that a lot of what has made you successful is innate, but you weren't. It was like, going back to a sports kind of analogy, because we've talked about sports a lot in this conversation, but like, if you are a phenomenal athlete, you're 6'6" and you can dunk, and you have all the tools to be a great basketball player, but you don't develop those skills and tools, then you're always going to be about, you're going to be good, but you're not going to be great. You had all these attributes, these skills, whatever you want to call them, and you worked relentlessly to build those and make those better. And that's how you've gotten to where you are today. I think that's probably like my biggest takeaway from this discussion. So a little bit of a soliloquy there, and I apologize, but I think that's just fascinating.
There's a great soliloquy, Clark.
Thank you, sir.
And I bet there's a great question.
There it is.
What?
You did great.
But like, I think that's a big lesson for anybody, because even if you have what Jake innately has or had, you can be great, but you're not going to be, you have to keep working at it to continue to be better and to be great. But even if you don't have the systemic thinking and the work ethic and the enterprising nature and stuff, you can probably still develop a lot of those skills along the way, especially with the right people in your life to help you. So anyway, it's probably not the appropriate juncture for my soliloquy, but I just think those are just such striking themes to me as we're talking and addressing some of these elements of your story. So anyway, that's my soliloquy, which I've said 3 or 4 times now. What's next for you, Atmosphere? What does that look like moving forward, if you even have a plan?
Yeah, I mean, if I could bridge those 2 topics there, I think for starters on the nature versus nurture piece, I'm as you can probably tell, I'm a bit of a nerd. Like I love to read, and it's more audiobooks because again, narcolepsy, I'll fall asleep in it, but mostly audiobooks for clarity. But there's to me, there's foundational texts in every realm that we can spend time in, right? Whether it's, in sales, there's these, foundational texts, so forth and so on. But I would say personal foundational texts, one of them that to me is really applicable to anybody on this planet, and that is Mindset by Carol Dweck. And it talks about, what you're articulating there, Clark, is there are the nature versus nurture game. The data from all these studies say that, sure, you're built a certain way and you got to lean in, right? You got to understand that and lean into it. And also none of us can let that be, defining or limiting. Right. And so that's where I get the 1% better every single day, is that, all the data says whatever you put your mind to, you obviously you can do, but whatever you put your mind to in terms of practicing and learning, it will come to you. Right. And so I think for me, that's kind of how I would answer this question, is that, I'm just very, very passionate about taking all the things that I feel fortunate to have, whether that's resources, tools, knowledge, so forth and so on, and sharing those at the greatest scale that I possibly can. Here at Atmosphere, the plan, the goal, the direction, the vision, the mission is to continue to scale this thing up. And so if I get an opportunity to take, my currently small but mighty team, and we have an opportunity to keep growing that, and I get more opportunities to amplify and magnify and multiply the potential impact that I can have in helping people, that's success. I look at these things, and this is probably a weird thing to say, which will be a public forum, but I look at every stage of our careers as laboratories, right? Like when you think about what's going on in laboratories with all these scientific experiments, so forth and so on, sometimes they're producing microwaves, sometimes they're producing the new, pharmaceutical breakthrough. And most of those labs, we have no idea where they are, and we have no idea if they're still around anymore. So right now, this laboratory for me is, how do we take this group of folks that has built this really cool thing to where it is today, and how do we 10x it? And in the process, how do we make sure that every single person that's part of that organization and part of that growth, that they get a ton of takeaways? Because what we know about businesses is they come and go, right? So hopefully this won't be around for 300 years. But if it's not, the only miss is if every single person here didn't get an incredible amount of life, professional experience, and growth out of this process. So really for me, it's I don't know what the next job is. I'd say it on here, but I'm not going to say what my boss's job is. I don't know what the next job is, because I don't feel like the work is done yet to amplify and magnify and multiply the impact that we can have, on each other here internally, and on our clients externally, and on the marketplace. So we're just going to continue to level up, and we're going to try and 10x everything that we're doing right now. And, we'll check the temp, we'll check the progress in 12 months, 24 months, so forth and so on. And as long as we're doing those things, I think we're on the right path.
That's awesome, man. I have one more question, but anything else for you, Cecily?
No.
Okay.
No more great questions.
Oh, well, she had the only good questions in this conversation, as we all know. Is there anything that you want to plug or promote or talk up while you're here, Jake, and have this platform? If you didn't know, we have 100 million listeners, 100 million downloads, obviously. So
I think you're going to dethrone Rogan pretty soon here. No, I think it's relevant that to share that Atmosphere TV, we're an entertainment organization, right? So we entertain folks on TVs after they leave their living room. So in bars, restaurants, gyms, medical facilities, you name it. So if I'm plugging anything, it would be, if you have a business and you have consumers who are staring at your TVs in there, we probably have a solution for you to help entertain them in the best possible way. And if you're a marketer who sees value in those folks who are looking at those screens, we probably have an advertising solution. Other than that, man, I'm just really, really grateful to be here, to have this conversation. I feel really, really gross because that's as much as I've talked about myself in a while, probably since the last time I hung out with you. And I just wanted to talk about this. But no, this is great.
No, man, this is really helpful for me. And I feel like I've learned too. And I'll try to put a bow on this. And I don't know if it will adequately do it. But I think the really cool part of you, but also any person who wants to live out their full potential. And, you mentioned like a God-fearing person, I put myself in that camp too. So I think I always couch it in more religious terms. But if you do those things and you do everything you can to live out your God-given purpose, then you're just going to be more productive. You're going to be happier. You're going to have a more fulfilling and exciting life. And the advantage of you, Jake, embracing these lessons so early on in your professional journey is you've been able to make a big impact now. You still have many years to see where life takes you. And I think that's a really exciting part, not only for you, but it's a lesson for everybody listening to this. Like, the more you realize your gifts and what you're good at and leaning into those things, the bigger impact you can make and live out your purpose. And I think that's what so many people don't do it. They just don't do it. They're at work, they're unfulfilled, they're not tapping into what they were made to do in life, or they're just refusing to work hard enough to see the fruits of that labor. And I think you're a really good object lesson for somebody who's figured out what you're good at, but then making the most of your very limited time here on earth. And that's such an exciting lesson, I think, for me and hopefully for everybody else who listens to this.
Agreed. Yeah, and appreciate it. And I think that it's a great way to put a bow on it. Another person I'm a fan of, Scott Galloway, and he talks a lot about that, and especially for younger professionals where, everyone's trying to find their passion, and you might not find it in the next 2 months. You might not find it in the next 6 months. You might not find it in the next 12. But what if you looked at what you were doing right now and you asked yourself, how can I be the absolute best at what I'm doing right now? How much more fulfillment might you get out of what you're doing? And so I think when you look at that over time, if you master a few different things, that's just tools in the toolbox. So if you're not feeling it right now, it's just take a look at it and say, what would it look like if I was the absolute best at what I do in the industry right now? What doors might that open for me? So yeah, I would tend to agree. I think it's a good way to wrap it up.
Yeah, keep moving forward. Okay, Jake, thank you so much. Thank you, Cecily. It's been awesome. And we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks, y'all.